Shabbat Shalom. How good it is for us to be together as one. It is a beautiful day. I also noticed that snowbirds are beginning to inch back, and I welcome those of you who I haven't seen in a while. It's good to have you back. So I spoke a little bit about the question and how we live with very important questions. God, God's self, introduced questions, some of which are still not answered, but which we continue to ask. I'm going to transition a little bit now to speak about something else, and what I'm going to speak about is blessing. I think we all know a thing or two about reciting a blessing. We know how to say a blessing before we drink a glass of wine. I know every one of us knows the motzi. And we know the blessings we say before we light candles, be it on Shabbat or Hanukkah. But blessings are not merely formulas that are recited at particular occasions in response to particular acts. Because in addition to saying blessings, we also know that there are people in our lives or occasions which we experience that serve as blessings. Those don't have the same formal religious connotation that formulas like Baruch Atah Adonai. Rather, they have to do with favors given or favor received. So I can say on behalf of just about all of you that this gathering, this community, this kehillah, is a blessing. It's a blessing to all of us, and we're all uplifted by it. I don't know if you know this, but in the entire Torah, there's only one injunction to be found about making a blessing. There's only one time when God commands us to recite a blessing. Do you know where it is or when it is? It's found this morning. It's the commandment to say a blessing after you enjoy a meal. I'm sorry, it's not in this week's parsha. It's a different parsha. But we're taught the following. V'alchalta v'savata uveirachta. When you eat and when you are satisfied, then you should say a blessing. And out of this grew an injunction which we know of as Birkat HaMazon. But there's this other notion of blessing. We find that this one in this week's parsha, and it's the idea of being a blessing. It occurs again and again throughout the book of Genesis. And there we find the following words. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed because of you. And so in the very beginning of this relationship between Abraham and God, between Abraham and future generations, his descendants, the Jewish people, God says, you should be a blessing to the world. And then the families of the world will be blessed because of you. I don't know about you, but I think it's a very heavy burden to carry. And I know that even if we, the Jewish people, don't take that seriously enough, certainly much of the world does. And in fact, you might want to consider the fact that Israel being at war creates a great deal of discord for many religious people in the world. Because although we might reject it, we're expected to live by a different standard. And at times that can be a little bit overwhelming. How do you live in this real world with an expectation to be different? The Torah does that to us. And some of us internalize that. But it is this very specific notion that we're special that creates great discomfort. We may feel that, but we don't want to be judged differently. And we also may understand that we're not special simply by being. We become special through the way we behave. I think that we have to accept it. I think we would do ourselves well and perhaps bring a gift to the world, as it were, if we saw ourselves, if we're willing to be proud enough and behave well enough to be a blessing to the world. And that's not to say that only we have that capacity or that ability. Every human being does. In a conversation that I had about Israel this moment of the war with my sister this past week, we reflected on the military and strategic defense of a particular move that was being made. And she responded, well, it may be what other armies would do, but ours is a Jewish army, she said. And she asked, doesn't that impose a different level of control and a different understanding of ethics? It's this notion that gives us this idea that even if nobody else around you is a mensch, you should be a mensch. Even if everyone around you is engaged in wrongdoing, let's say some type of cheating, you have to understand that you do not and you should not. It says that doing charity is not just a good deed, it's an obligation. And sometimes that's difficult, but I think it's intended to be challenging, because this grows out of the very first covenant that Abraham makes with God. This understanding that you have to set yourself apart. And you set yourself apart not by faith, but by your actions. And so if we're a blessing to others, we have the capacity to create some kind of shift in the energy of the world. We can bring blessing, and then we will be blessed. I'm now going to say something that has nothing to do with strategy or political reality of this moment. It rather has to do with a type of vision or aspiration. Imagine if we could enter into a conversation with any other person, any other people. Imagine if we could be forgiving to those that we considered to be our enemies. Imagine if through our forgiveness we could create peace. Who amongst you would say that that would not be transformative, have the potential to transform any situation? This capacity to be forgiving of those we feel hurt us or those we fear. I often feel that my religious understanding and desires create aspirations for the world which does not exist, but for a world that I believe could be. You know the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is the great body of mystical wisdom that describes many things which exist in the universe, including very detailed descriptions about the process that brought the world into being, about creation and about the Creator. And in the mystical understanding of creation, there is a discussion of two types of vessels for God's creative energy. One type was a container that was open at the top and closed at the bottom. And this container allowed the life force which came from God to flow into it, but it did not allow that force to flow out the other side. It was closed. And the other type served as a conduit for divine energy, the life force that flowed from the Spirit of God. And it went into the container and flowed out of the container. And it's a metaphor, obviously. It's a metaphor for those who receive and hold on to those positive blessings but ultimately they will self-destruct. Just like that container, according to the Kabbalah, it was shattered. It couldn't hold anymore. It would only receive. It would take more and more and more. The container that allowed the special holy force pass in and go through, pass out, it was able to hold God's creative purpose. God's energy flowed through that container. And I think this goes for us also. We learn that we can take a cue from the vessels of creation. No true good, no true goodness can be enjoyed in this world if we don't have the capacity to pass it on, to pass it forward. The mystical tradition is teaching us that we are to be open-ended vessels. Blessings aren't meant to come to us and just stay with us. Blessings are meant to come to us and flow through us. And you know and I know that sometimes that is really difficult. It's so hard to be a person who is always willing to give. And maybe it's even harder when we live in a world that manifests so much selfishness and cruelty. So as I spoke about earlier, we went through a pretty bitter election season. And we heard a lot of horrible things said about other people and other groups. Things that need not be said and should never be said. A few days ago, before Election Day, Dick Van Dyke, and I'm sure all of you remember Dick Van Dyke, who's now like 90 or 100 years old. You know him from Mary Poppins, perhaps from the Dick Van Dyke Show itself. He read a piece from Rod Sterling, which was entitled A Most Non-Political Speech. And Dick Van Dyke read this from a 1964 Religious Witness for Human Dignity event. It was a half a year after Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It goes like this. Hatred is not the norm. Prejudice is not the norm. Suspicion, dislike, jealousy, scapegoating, none of those are the transcendent facet of the human personality. These are the human diseases. These are the cancers of the soul. They are the infectious and contagious viruses that have been breeding in humanity for years. But because they have been and because they are, it's not necessary for us to believe that they should be or shall be. And then Dick Van Dyke continued reading from the speech. To those who tell us that inequality of the human is a necessary evil, we must respond by simply saying that first, it is evil, but second, it's not necessary. We prove it by reaffirming our faith. We prove it by having faith in that which we affirm. And then he said, let us be ashamed to live without that victory. After reading from the speech, Dick Van Dyke added that a lot has happened since 1964. Perhaps not nearly as much as Dr. King dreamed. But that was a start. I feel pretty convinced that when we are commanded to be a blessing to the world, it can be seen in measurable ways. And I believe it begins with the way we treat each other. I believe it has to do with the responsibilities that we're willing to take for our own families, our own communities, and our people, and for all people. If we live lives of blessing in that way, then we'll treat others with dignity and respect and kindness. You know, each and every one of us receives kindness and good and love. Some take it in. They save it in their vessel, perhaps dole out a little here and there to an old buddy or a close family member, but they guard the goodness so tightly. We should be generous with our goodness. We are and should be a blessing by virtue of our goodness, our willingness to engage a stranger, to smile at one we pass by in the road, through hugs and invitations. When we give or help or lend a hand, we're a blessing. And then what happens is that those whom we bless begin to bless others. It's true. Do you know how I know it's true? Because I have been witnessed through many years as a professional, as a rabbi, people who were transformed not just by what they received, but they were transformed by the fact that they learned how to give, that they gave kindness, that they showed a willingness to fight for the things which were right, to stand on the side of justice. The Torah teaches us to remember that we were strangers in a land not our own. In fact, the Torah teaches it over 30 times more than any other teaching. Remember that you were slaves. Remember that you were strangers. And it does so for a reason. Because the Torah knew that one day we would be in a position of power. We would have choices to make. We would be more blessed. And then we have to learn how we treat others. Strangers, people who are different, people with less. And so God in the Torah tells Abraham to be a blessing, and that favor him as a blessing from the families of the earth. They will be blessed because of him, and they will bless him. I see adult children who are blessings to their elderly parents. I've seen teachers who are blessings to their students. And I know grandparents who are blessings to their grandchildren. What would happen if you were to ask yourself, is the world a better place because you're here? Do the lives that you live add anything to the sum total of blessings in the world? I hope so. So we've been through this difficult season. And now we are witness to the election of Donald Trump as our 47th president. I have a hope. My hope is that we will walk forward into the future understanding that we've received a commandment to be a blessing to the world. And in spite of what we may see around us, we're always going to aspire to make the world better, to contribute in some way, to be engaged and involved in some way, not to just sit back as bitter people, but become better people. The Torah gives us an example of someone who was willing to do just that. Avraham, he left his father's home, he left his homeland. Perhaps it was a place of relative comfort. But he took a risk and he went out to start a people that could be a blessing to the world, and through them the world could be blessed. That's the text we inherit. So all of us have work to do. Every single one of us has work to do. The rabbis taught us it's not upon us to complete the work, but we're not free to desist from trying. Each one of us has been blessed by someone in our lives. Teachers, parents, siblings, friends. Let us use those blessings to make the world better. Let us allow our container of life to be open on both sides. Shabbat Shalom.